All right, hello everyone. I see lots of names pouring into the Zoom room. Thank you so much for waking up early on this Friday morning. We'll get started in just about 3 or 4 minutes. So get your coffee, get settled. And you'll see on the screen here are a few of our links that we'll be sharing throughout the session. But if you want to get started by putting them down now in your notebook, these are ways to get engaged, stay connected with us, but also continue the conversation and follow how we're going forward with this engagement process. And again, thank you so much for joining us here on, and depending on where you are, it's here in Victoria, it's a bit of a cloudy morning. So again, as we're waiting for people to come in, continue to come in, then we'll just wait a couple more minutes, especially because it's a Friday morning. So, and my name is Chris O'Connor. I'm a learning program developer here today, and your host today, your facilitator today is Kiata. Hi, Kiata.
Good morning, everyone. So pleased to be with you today. Can't wait to get started. We've got some really interesting information to share with you, and so pleased you've taken time out of your morning to be with us. So we're just waiting, as Chris said, for a few more participants to join, and then we'll begin the program.
All right, Kiata, I'm gonna stop my video and mute myself. So you're on, and in just a couple seconds, we'll get going.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I want to welcome everyone to today's dialogue session. My name's Kihata Morvising from Modus Planning, Design, and Engagement, and I'll be your facilitator for today. Before starting the program, I would like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, the Songhees, and the Esquimalt nations. We extend our appreciation for the opportunity to live and learn on this territory. A few housekeeping notes. We are using the Zoom webinar platform for the information session today. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, the best way to do so is through the Q&A feature. And I know this might be a little different than how you usually use Zoom. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat, which is probably familiar to people, but there's also a Q&A, and it's better to use the Q&A than the chat, just so we make sure that we see your questions or comments. You can put questions or comments into the Q&A at any time, but we're not going to be getting to the question portion until about 30 or 45 minutes into the program, just so you know. During this presentation, we will have some opportunities for you to also participate in some live polling to share your thoughts with us. It's pretty fun technology called Menti, so I'll be introducing that to you in a little bit. But first, I want to walk you through our agenda for today. So Alicia Dubois, the Royal BC Museum CEO, will begin with a brief presentation about the future of the museum. She may be joined by Chris O'Connor or Janet Hanous, who will also potentially be co-presenting. And then this presentation will be followed by a live polling activity, and then and then a Q&A period. So during the Q&A session, as I mentioned, you can submit your questions in the Q&A feature of the web platform. And then as facilitator, I will pose these questions to the Royal BC Museum staff. wanted to just give a little background about the purpose of this dialogue. So, every engagement process needs a purpose. The purpose of these sessions will be facilitated over the course of several months. And there's a few different goals. So one goal, and probably the most important, is just to build relationships with you as the public that help to facilitate better understanding between the museum and the public. The Royal BC Museum really wants to earn your trust. Another goal for today is just for us to listen to all British Columbians, which is why we're actually taking this session that you're seeing on the road across the entire province. So we're trying to visit different geographic locations across the province, and I also offer this online so that people can join at their convenience. And by doing this, we hope to enhance our relevance with current audience members, many of whom already love and care for the museum so much. But we also want to open new doors for those who have in the past perhaps felt like they're outsiders or not have seen themselves represented in the museum. And that leads to the last point, which is we understand that the museum needs to reshape itself. It needs to be more inclusive of diverse communities and groups who have not been previously actively included. So that's some of the goals for today. I also wanted to share just a few guidelines for respectful exchange. I feel like I probably don't even need to say these because people are often so well behaved on online forums, but just to sort of provide a couple reminders. We really value your perspective, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. But we just want to make sure that we have a respectful exchange. So there's a couple ways that we have suggestions around that. So first is there's multiple ways you can contribute, and we want everyone to feel like they can contribute at the way that feels comfortable to them. So you can certainly contribute to the Q&A, as I mentioned, at the bottom of your screen. We're going to do some live polling through Mentimeter, and you can contribute in that way. Later on, we'll also be chatting you a survey link. In fact, we could even chat that now if people want to fill out the survey while they're listening. And this is a survey, just intended to get some more information from you about what you might like in future engagement opportunities with the museum. And we have an email if you'd like to send like a direct message or ask some direct questions that we can also put in the chat. So what I would say is when we get to the Q&A session, if you have a question similar to someone else, as a moderator, I might combine questions, but I want to just let you know if you feel as I've combined questions that I didn't do justice to your particular question, please let me know. I do want everyone to feel heard and comfortable. I also wanted to inform you that there will be future opportunities for deeper engagement starting this spring. So today is intended to be some preliminary engagement to reveal some initial thoughts and ideas, but we're going to be digging more deeply into these issues in phase 2 of the process. And the Royal BC Museum staff will share a bit more about that later today. Wanted to just say, we understand that you're here today because you're passionate and care about the museum. We just ask you to use respectful language and respect the views of others so we have a productive conversation. Please speak for yourself and not for others. Speak to be heard and listen to understand. And we would like everyone here to feel safe and respected in the conversation, even if people disagree, and disagreement's okay. And then finally, I just wanted to remind people again, if you end up having further questions that we don't get to, there is the email that we will provide you, and you're very welcome to reach out. So I wanted to warm up the group with a little fun activity through a technology called Mentimeter. And my colleague is going to provide 2 ways for you to connect with Mentimeter. There's a link that you can click on your computer, and you should be able to click out to the screen. Or if you prefer to use like a smartphone so that you can see the screen, you can actually use this, go to the website menti.com and use the code 43560910. And forgive this, it says, where are you joining us from this evening? This is actually this morning, but I think you get the idea. So just love to know where people are joining us from today. And I see the results already rolling in. Some people are learning how to use this pretty quickly. So we've got Victoria, Saanich, Esquimalt, Maple Ridge, Ottawa, and we'll just give this a second. Vancouver, we'll give this a moment for people to respond. I personally love watching these results come in because it's just, sort of mesmerizing to watch the screen change. It looks like Saanich is getting bigger, Vancouver's getting bigger, which means there's more than one person from those areas. And we've got Langley, Campbell River, Chilliwack, West Vancouver. It's great to see people from different places today. Really exciting to see that. And I will say, if you have any trouble using this technology, you can feel free to also ask a question in the Q&A, and we can see if we can get back to you with some suggestions. Okay, yeah, it looks like I'm trying to see Maple Ridge. I think we said that one. So it looks like there's quite a spread of folks. We'll give this just another minute. Oh, Kelowna. We've got someone from Kelowna joining. Quite a few people from Victoria. And Prince George, great. Yeah, lots of different places. And Saanich / Victoria, okay. Coquitlam. I love this. It's fun to just see where people are coming from. I think that's one of the very cool things about online technology is we can connect from all over the place. Main Island. All right. So feel free to keep inputting responses, but I think I'll take us to the next slide. So we do have another slide to provide some feedback. And that is what topics attracted you to the presentation today? We've got some different choices here. Learning about changes at the museum and archives, updates on galleries and exhibitions, just, what's coming up or what's changing. People who wanted to hear the new museum CEO speak, seemed like an interesting way to spend the morning. Interested in learning more about repatriation and reconciliation. And looks right now, learning about changes in the museum is in lead. This is a bit like calling horse racing. Oh, and then we've got the updates on galleries and exhibitions as sort of second interest so far. But a lot of people interested in repatriation and reconciliation as well. Definitely some people wanting to hear Alicia Dubois speak, the new CEO. And this is really helpful to us because it helps us to know where to focus some of our comments today, just in terms of what you're interested in. So we see that people are very interested in learning about changes at the museum and archives. Well, thanks for trying out Mentimeter with me. I find this a very fun way to do online presentations, just so everyone can engage a little bit. So I will probably close the poll for now. But we're gonna go back to this a bit later. So we can re-chat out the links and code at that time. So let me just stop the share there. But I want to introduce our speakers for today. So we have the privilege of being joined by Alicia Dubois, the Royal BC Museum's Chief Executive Officer. She joined the Royal BC Museum in about this time last year, actually. So she brings with her really a wealth of leadership experience. So her depth of expertise includes a strong focus on championing diversity and inclusion and intercultural understanding with the organizations she has helped lead. These organizations include the Native Child and Family Services of Toronto, Scotiabank and CIBC, and most recently the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation in Calgary. Alicia has also served for 3 years as a member of the Royal Ontario Museum's Board of Trustees and continues as an honorary trustee. We're also joined by Chris O'Connor, who leads the learning program at the Royal BC Museum. So Chris's experience is in the very interactive. He'll have a lot to potentially share today. Chris is also helping us with some of our technology. So maybe playing some dual roles. And then we also may be joined by Janet Hanous, who's the Vice President of Engagement and DRIPA implementation. Janet has over 20 years of experience with program design, Indigenous engagement, and rights holder and stakeholder relations. And I do want to acknowledge that there's a number of other Royal BC Museum staff on the panel today who may just be pulled in for questions as they pertain to them. So we're just really looking forward to a great conversation today. And I will pass the floor over to Alicia to tell you some of the interesting things that are going on in the museum.
Thank you, Kiara, and welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to join you all and have the opportunity to answer some of the questions that have been raised and to just have some great conversation. So I wanted to start with an overview of the engagement that we are undertaking now and what the process is going to look like, because I think that understanding the full picture will be helpful in placing today's conversation. So we are going to be visiting all regions of the province over the next few months, and we look forward to meeting in person, in addition to having virtual sessions like this for those who aren't able to make our in-person meetings. And in light of the fact that I see so many people are joining from Vancouver or the Lower Mainland or area, I just wanted to say that next week we're actually going to be in your region. We will be at the Museum of Surrey on Monday morning, and then we will be at the Museum of Vancouver in the evening. And then on Tuesday, we will be at the Richmond Cultural Center. And so perhaps what we'll do is at some point in the session, we can put up the locations and times in the chat, just so that everybody knows, because it's always nice to meet in person now that we're able to. So the engagement is going to be, this phase that we're going through right now is really an opportunity for us to meet with British Columbians and listen to what is most on their mind and be able to answer questions. There's three fundamental reasons why this is so important for us at this stage. One is so that we have the opportunity to build relationships or build on very strong relationships that we have already. Another is that through that relationship building, what we aim to do, because of the evolution of the museum, is to ensure that we're creating relationships that allow us to co-create with communities. So I think, as many people understand, museums are traditionally very colonial institutions, and they have tended to be the directors of history as opposed to the facilitators of storytelling and history telling. And that for us is very important. What we hope to do is build relationships that allow us to work with communities for, all of the years to come, frankly, in the way that we are able to share our shared history. And that is going to be, as we say, with community at the center and with community as authority, so that they are in charge of telling their own histories as opposed to having somebody else do that on their behalf. And then the other important aspect of the engagement is that in having these conversations with everybody from around the province, we know we're going to be having different discussions. We know that each of the different regions and municipalities have their own objectives, they have their own challenges, and they also have their own unique relationship with the museum. And that varies from having an intimate relationship with the museum to a much more distant relationship to the museum. We want to make sure that we are being relevant and impactful in serving British Columbians, because ultimately that's our role. Our role is not to serve just the people who are within our proximity, but to make sure that the incredible education programming that our team creates and then shares with educational institutions across the province are actually having the reach that they should have. We continue to develop new programming. We want to make sure that those programs are accessible to the schools and school districts around the province. And of course, we have incredible expertise with our researchers and our collections management people. And we want to make sure that that expertise is shared and that we're having meaningful conversations and able to bring a lot of insight and inspiration to British Columbians all over the province. So us being able to be out in the province and have really important conversations allows us to ensure that we're being relevant and impactful. So that for us is ultimately the aim of this first component of engagement. What's really important about that is building trust. And I know that often it feels as though the museum might be behind a curtain and it's difficult to see what's inside, and perhaps there's a sense that there has been a lack of transparency. We also recognize that it's very important for us to be open and frank and have transparent conversations in order to build the trusting relationships that we need in order to be able to co-create exhibitions and experiences and educational programs alongside communities, to be the facilitator of that work. So that I just wanted to lay that groundwork. There's been some I guess, challenges around the thought that our engagement process may be multi-yeared. And at the end of the day, what is most important in this process is that we're leaving room for British Columbians to have discussions with us, to share with us their thoughts and what's most important to them and what they think we ought to be considering in this process. And then to ensure that we come back and that we continue to have conversations, that these conversations are not a one and done, but it actually becomes who we are as the province's museum. And in that process, we also want to ensure that we're leaving enough space for people who perhaps have been marginalized from the conversations or who have attempted to participate in these conversations to have the space to be comfortable to speak up. You know, we see time and time again in the in-person sessions that there are some people who are very comfortable to speak up and say their piece. Others are much more comfortable to quietly work on writing down their comments and sharing it on the sticky in the comment corner. And others prefer to send an email through our Engage email box, which, you know, we monitor on a regular basis and we answer. And what we want to make sure is that we're leaving enough space for those voices who tend to be underrepresented to have a voice and to feel comfortable and safe in having those conversations with us. And so part of this is going to mean that we're also having unique multicultural engagement sessions. So we will be meeting with discrete cultural communities, including First Nations, but not exclusive to First Nations. That was a real important sentiment that has been raised, and people are wanting to ensure that we're having very broad discussions when it comes to all of the different multicultural communities that have contributed and often sacrificed for the benefit of the province. And I just want to make sure that we're being very clear that yes, we will be in a pointed way meeting with First Nations and Indigenous communities, but we will also be meeting very, very pointedly and intentionally with the various multicultural communities that that are also a very important part of the fabric of our province. So I'd like to touch on the impact of the museum. There's some interesting statistics that maybe people don't know about our provincial museum. And Chris will, I'll invite Chris to chat at some point about the the reach of the learning team. The learning program and educational programming that we have includes a few dozen different unique experiences that get shipped to different schools across the province, and it tends to include a really interesting aspect of our history and a replica of a collection item that can be touched and handled by students. So it's very interactive, along with programming for teachers so that they can engage with the package and the small exhibit that gets sent out and really bring it to life within their classrooms. The learning team also does travel and has incredible relationships with different schools all over the province. And we also have, as I said before, incredible expertise with our researchers, and they have a number of touch points through post-secondary educational institutions and also through different community groups and organizations that are focused on biodiversity and BC's natural history. What's interesting is that every year on a typical basis, the museum sees between 800,000 and 900,000 visitors per year who actually come to the museum and visit. That's a pretty remarkable number. But what's really interesting and what a lot of people don't know is that we also have been working diligently over the last few years to digitize the collection and archives to make them available to the public. And what might be an interesting fact for you to consider is that while, you know, almost 1 million people come through the door, it's actually almost 3 million people who access our collections digitally. And these are not just all academics who are focused on very pointed research. It's the public. It's people who enjoy learning more about the province and are feeling inclined to engage and learn more about themselves or their families and their place within the province itself. So that always seems to be an interesting statistic because it's not always talked about. So a lot of conversations have been had, and I see that there's people from all over, but I do recognize that there are some local people. And I will say that during our local sessions so far, there's a lot of conversation about what is happening on the third floor, and in particular, the status of Old Town, which I know is something that is loved by the province. There's been some social media about Old Town being destroyed and dismantled. And I do want to just say off the top that that is actually not the case. And I'll get into some of the challenges that we have at the museum, but Old Town actually can't be destroyed until we have a better sense of what is happening in the event it is determined that in fact there might be a significant change to the facility. So even if there was an inclination to be changing the third floor significantly, whether it was for a move or just a complete revamp, it would require very significant abatement work, very expensive abatement work that would take significant time, because Old Town, along with the entire museum, is lined throughout with asbestos. And this is not probably surprising for those of you who know that the museum was built in the 1960s. Asbestos, as I think most of us understand, was used very commonly for a number of reasons, for insulation, for as an adhesive, for as a fire retardant. So just the fact that it was just all pervasive in construction at that time, it's not surprising that it is all throughout the museum. But that for us is a very important consideration about the future of the museum and also our ability to evolve and to change some of the core galleries. Because the other challenge too is that the ventilation of the museum does not allow us to close off sections and do that kind of work without closing down the museum. So that, just to let everybody know that, the third floor is going to be welcoming new exhibitions. And that's going to be in the part where Our Living Languages once was and Legacy Hall was. The First Peoples Gallery has been kept mostly as it was, and our intention is to actually host Indigenous engagement sessions in that space so that community members can be around the exhibition and around the belongings and artifacts that are in that space. And we can also look at the way that things had history and the way that Indigenous existence and experiences had been portrayed, and really look at how we can do that better, but again, in a co-creative way so that we're looking at it together and receiving feedback. So we're looking forward to that. Old Town, on the other hand, is a bit more challenging. And it's challenging because, for the most part, it portrays a very narrow aspect of British Columbia's history. And so we know that there's work to do there so that we can ensure that all voices of those who live in the province and who have contributed to the province are portrayed there, and that it's not just a very uniform view of what makes up a traditional older British Columbian town. And so that also leaves us with incredible opportunity to work with communities and to understand what they would like to see in that space. And so in the event it's determined that the museum is not going to look at redevelopment in a fulsome way, then there's an opportunity to reimagine Old Town in a way that is much more diverse and inclusive, so that when people come to the museum, they actually can see themselves in it, no matter who they are. So that's some of the important work. And we're really looking forward to doing that work with communities around the province. So I think I'd also like to touch on some of the very important fundamental governing principles and values that are vital and foundational to the museum's operations. The first, of course, is the Museum Act. So the Museum Act was constituted so that the museum's mandate was formalized and recognized in law. And so in the Museum Act, it's very easy to see that the purpose of the museum is set out, and that focuses very, very strongly on being an educational institution, on doing research around the natural and human history of the province, and to also have a collection and develop a collection strategically that also represents the natural and human history of the province, and that we take good care of that collection, because at the end of the day, it's not ours. It's not the museum's collection. It's the province's collection, and we're here to serve the province with respect to that, and that is never lost on us. The other very important piece of legislation that is relatively new, but is vital in the way forward for the museum, is DRIPA. So DRIPA is a piece of legislation that was enacted by the provincial government a few years ago, and it is a mechanism that ensures that British Columbia is honoring the principles that are set out in UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People. UNDRIP, which is of course the short form that many people have heard, is essentially a visionary framework that allows the nation states who sign onto it to understand their role in supporting and honoring and acknowledging the Indigenous people who live in their nation and who were the first peoples of that land. And the way that UNDRIP sets that out is by stating the importance that Indigenous peoples' right to keeping up their traditions and honoring their culture, their language, being engaged in society by means of education in a way that resonates with their tradition, by engaging in the economy and also in politics and Indigenous governance. So UNDRIP essentially aims to uphold all of these traditional practices and belief systems so that they are able to continue to exist and in some instances, of course, be revitalized within the modern context. Ultimately, it also, and I think this is very important, and it goes back to our desire to be co-creative and to be a facilitator of storytelling, is ensuring that Indigenous people do have the opportunity to exercise their right to self-determination. And that self-determination is a sense of of autonomy, of independence, of not being governed by another cultural political system that that runs contrary to their own culture and governance systems, etc. So in light of that, that is something that is going to be a very significant part of the museum's evolution also. That is an important context that we exist in and that we are wholeheartedly embracing. And that means that there will be elements of UNDRIP and DRIPA that will be weaved throughout our policies and our procedures, and also the way that we participate with the province in the engagement process. We also want to make sure that we are honoring, as I said before, all of the diverse communities. And so of course, when we think about diverse communities, we think culturally diverse communities, but we're actually extending it beyond that, which is a very new approach. So something that is very important to us is that we have a facility that is very welcoming for people who have physical or accessibility challenges. We also want to ensure that we are working with organizations that can help us be insightful and reflective of the needs of visitors who may have mental health needs. We'll be creating a youth advisory council for the engagement process. And we recognize that that's important because we need to be engaging with British Columbians of all ages. And we've had some really great conversations throughout our engagement process around, how will we engage with children? And that participatory museum, of course, comes into that conversation, and ensuring that children have a place to come in and not just read, but really explore is so important. I think that we've been very strong. Our learning team has been exceptional in providing experiences like that travel the province. But having that experience in the museum is very important too. And of course, that's easy to imagine for children. But frankly, we want to be able to provide those participatory experiences where visitors of all ages are coming in and getting to be hands-on and really engaging. And of course, we also want to ensure that as part of this engagement process, we're hearing from community members that that are affiliated with the LGBTQ2S++ community. So all to say, we're putting people first in this process. And we want to ensure that when people come to the museum, they can see themselves in it and they can feel like it is actually a gathering place because it's open to them and it speaks to them in a meaningful way. So some interesting history about the museum, and I'll also get into some other conversations that we've had. The beauty of having the engagement sessions is that each one takes on its own personality and lots of very interesting conversations come up. And so it means that we get to add a bit more to each of the engagement sessions we do, because we're learning more and more the more we hear from the public. And so one thing that is interesting is that there was a time when the museum was actually under the Department of Education, which really speaks to the legislative mandate of the museum. A lot of people view the museum as a tourist destination, and we're very proud to be a tourist partner, of course, for our local economy. We know that that is important, but that is not all that the museum is. The museum truly is an educational institution. It's a place where families and children get to come and be inspired and have insightful, introspective experiences that hopefully help them to have different conversations outside of the museum. The aim of this is to invite people in so that they have the opportunity to engage and have a new view of themselves and their place in the province, and are able to then step outside the museum and maybe show up better for each other and also for our environment. And that for us is, I would say, the most inspiring part of the work that we do and what we strive to do. And so the fact that it had been under the ministry or the Department of Education between the 1940s and the 1960s, I think, is very insightful. The other interesting thing is that and I think that it's important to have the conversation about it, is that there's, I think, a tendency for people to think that, you know, the museum is a Crown agency and therefore is fully funded by the government. And that is not the case. So our annual budget, so the dollars we spend in order to be open and to serve British Columbians, is based upon a grant from the government, which makes up 50% of our spending, and own source revenue, which makes up the other 50% of our spending. And of course, own source revenue comes from admissions, memberships, some of the revenues that we generate from experiences or events or educational programming. But ultimately, there is a requirement for the museum to generate its own funding in order to be effective in fulfilling its mandate under the legislation, under the Museum Act, and also to ensure that we are offering meaningful, insightful experiences for the province. So we see now that there's an incredible opportunity for us to learn from the province. And we're going to spend the next few months, as I said, engaging in a way that really opens up those doors, that shows that we're committed to this process, and not just for the formal engagement that surrounds the future of the museum, but this is really an avenue and a way that we're all committed to advancing our relationship with British Columbians for the long term. And so while from a community engagement perspective around the facility, we anticipate that we will be engaging with the province for probably at least 2 years, perhaps 3. We're ultimately internally looking at a 5 and a 10-year plan to ensure that these conversations continue, because we know that this is a journey, and we know that in order to show up for the province, we need to be available and present for the province. And that means keeping in touch, understanding the evolution of what is happening for communities and what their priorities are, and that we're responding in a meaningful way. What I want to get into, we've had a chance to talk about Old Town, but I also want to get into the redevelopment plans. And I think, unfortunately, while we did have a technical briefing that was open to the press following the announcement of the redevelopment plans for the museum, And then of course, after that, the cancellation of it. Unfortunately, I don't think that the message around the challenges of the facility were really articulated in a way that the public was able to digest it. And so I want to touch on a bit of that because that is very important context for the museum. And frankly, it's context that has been well known for quite some time. Pauline Rafferty was a CEO, two CEOs before me. And in 2001, she toured the province with models of what the museum might look like, because redevelopment, even at that time, so over 20 years ago, was understood as needing to be done at some point relatively soon. And so she actually took these models across the province and talked about what the future of the museum might look like. And that was under the Liberal government. And so you can see that there have been a number of conversations involving a number of people around this conversation. But what is really important is for British Columbians to understand the challenges that we face. So at the end of the day, we have some critical infrastructure improvements that are necessary. Over the years, so going back to Pauline Rafferty's time, over the years, we have known, based upon the severity of the infrastructure challenges, that at some point there's going to have to be a significant investment. In knowing that, the maintenance was often deferred because it was going to be expensive, and there was a desire to not put good money after bad. And so to give you some context. So for instance, our escalators, what was really interesting is that when we were told that the third floor was going to reopen, we faced a significant challenge and concern in that our escalators between the second and the third floor were not working. And the escalators that we have, which were installed decades ago, are now obsolete. They no longer make them and they no longer make parts. So in order to get the escalators working for the opening of the third floor, which we are now looking forward to, we actually had to have a number of parts machined. In the event that was not going to be a solution, that we couldn't machine the parts or the escalators would still not begin to work, our challenge would have been that we would have needed to get new escalators, which would have been several $1 million and would have required some bolstering of the floor on the third floor, and I believe on the second floor too, because we have floor loading issues. And that means that the floor can only take so much weight, otherwise the integrity of it is at risk. And so that's an issue with the escalators. Very thankfully, we were able to get them working, and we're looking forward to having people up on the third floor. The other challenge is the elevators. The elevators are at risk of failure. They are quite old, and the infrastructure behind them are not strong, and so that for us is always a going concern. The building envelope is degrading, and so are some of the inner structures. So for instance, a couple weeks ago, we had a number of visitors in for engagement actually in the Newcomb Hall, which is our conference hall. And next door, we were inviting some of the participants in the engagement session to join the learning team. And above those two rooms is the tide pool in the natural history exhibition. And the tide pool started to leak. And so there was leaking into the learning team space. And that was surprising for the participants for that to be happening while they were there. And frankly, these malfunctions are things that we manage on a daily basis. Or at least a weekly basis. There's always something that needs some attention. We also have plumbing infrastructure that is very easily overwhelmed when we have a lot of rain, and it means that gray water leaks actually in various places in the museum. And then of course we have the hazmat, so the hazardous material, asbestos challenges, and those are very significant. There was a lot of concern about an 8-year closure when the museum redevelopment was discussed. And what's important to understand is that there is so much abatement work required in both the Fannin and the exhibition hall that the abatement work alone would have taken 2 years. And that's necessary in order to proceed with any construction, because of course that poses very significant risk to the public. So, so we're very conscientious about what is contained in the museum. We have regular air quality testing. And as the team has been working in different areas of the museum, we've continued to test different materials to ensure that everybody is safe. In the event those testing results came back to be unsafe, then of course we would have to respond in a very different way, and that would mean closure. So in order to deal with it, but we were very conscientious about that. And then of course there's seismic challenges. And we have 2 buildings that are equally at risk for seismic challenges. And we recognize that that's the case for all of the buildings around us, and that those are challenges that in general buildings of our age face. Nonetheless, being the building that holds the cultural and natural history of the province, and also invites the public in and has 160 people working in the facilities on a daily basis, the seismic challenges are most certainly a concern. So, so that gives a little bit of background, and I'm really happy to answer more questions about that, because that's actually just a few of the points that I think are probably most pointed. So I think what I would like to do now is perhaps talk about the exhibitions that are going to be coming to us, so that we can look forward, which we really are. We now have the escalators working, so we're looking forward to having visitors to the 3rd floor. We are holding events up on the 3rd floor until the exhibition arrives for display, which is exciting. So we're holding events for some of our partners as they gather people together. And when people come into the museum, we are just waiting for some of the work to be done on the 3rd floor. And then we will be doing some small tours actually up of the 3rd floor, so that people can actually see Old Town. The interesting thing about Old Town is that the bones and the infrastructure, the structure is still there, but a lot of the props and artifacts have been decanted. And I'm just going to go through really quickly what that means, because that's a museum term and a lot of people gain a lot of insight in that. So of course, there is a plan for us to be moving toward the collections and research building. We have one more approval to get before there is a full and final move ahead on that, but we are most certainly at the very end. We've proceeded through the RFP process and are ready to get into the final stages, which essentially is finalizing a contract. So that's very exciting. But the decanting process is important because, as I think a lot of people know, we have over 7 million artifacts, and all of them will be looking to go to the collections and research building, and that's a very long process. So we're in the midst of that, and that requires each of those artifacts to be moved. And so for the items that have been on display, as I said before, we use the term decant, but it means that we bring together a number of teams from within the museum to support the preparation of those artifacts very carefully for packing and then moving. And so that process includes our conservationists. they come and they look at the artifacts. And very frankly, it's actually quite hard on artifacts for them to be sitting out on display under the lights for decades at a time. And for those artifacts that experience that in Old Town, they often require a bit more attention. So the conservationists give them that attention and take care of them. They write a report on the condition of the artifact. There are pictures taken, and then there's also a short description that is written about the artifact, up to 25 words, that goes into our system so that when we want to retrieve that artifact at a later time, we can put in keywords and it will pop up and we'll be able to identify where it is, because when the artifact is packed, it also gets a barcode. So as part of the packing process, there are forms that are made uniquely for the artifacts so that they are safe in the boxes that they go into. If we're lucky, the artifact is small and it can go into a ready-made tub and have a barcode on it and be put away. For the larger items or the more abnormally shaped artifacts, our exhibitions team and carpenters actually create custom crates for those artifacts for safe keeping. So that's that when we say decanting, it's a very lengthy and detailed process, and that happens for all of the artifacts that that are making the move. So I think what I will do is I'll leave it there, because I think we'll have a chance to come back and have conversations about a couple more points. I'll talk about the actual exhibits that are coming when we come back, and I'll also be sure to answer some of the questions.
Great, thank you, Alicia. A lot of interesting information shared, and I'm sure people will have some questions and comments. To warm up the group a bit as we move into a question and answer session, we wanted to do a little bit more live polling. So if you can return to Mentimeter, if you have it up on your phone or computer, that would be great. If you don't have it up, my colleagues, Chris will chat the code and link again. So I'm gonna share the screen. It looks like we already have one answer to this question, and the question is, after hearing the presentation today, what topics did Alicia mention that you would like to discuss further? So I'll give people a moment to respond to this and think about what topics you'd like to learn a little bit more about. So I'll read a few of these as they come in and give people some more time to respond. It looks like there's a couple people who have some further questions about Old Town. Wondering how community input will progress with the future plans for Old Town. I think people also, I saw a comment just wondering what will happen to Old Town. It looks like there's a couple of people interested in collections and research building in the archives. So there's some questions wanting to know a bit more about that. I know that there was one individual who offered to host a session in Prince George. But I would say that individuals, if you want to chat your contact info into the Q&A, then we'll be able to capture that so that we know to reach out to you. And thank you for that offer. It looks like there's some comments around just wanting to know what the plan is for the next sort of the coming year and a half. Some interesting ideas about future community events like pub nights and Halloween party. That sounds fun to think about. What studies have been done to understand who is underrepresented, who is not coming or benefiting from the museum? So wanting to know what the background has been around that. I think there were a couple comments around the name of the museum and decolonizing the name of the museum. So we'll give people another minute here to type in some topics. I think you're able to type in more than one. And then I might pull out some themes here for Alicia to respond to. People are getting the hang of this Menti. It's sort of fun to use. Okay, so what I think I'm going to do is use these slides here to seed some questions for the Q&A. But I'm going to take us to one more slide just to continue to gather your opinions on some things, and then we'll move into a conversation. So know that we're coming back to what has been surfaced here. And oops, gone too far. So this is another prompt that says, share one word that gives you hope about the future of the Royal BC Museum. We're hoping you're hopeful, but you know, if your word is not related to hope, you can also share another word, but would love to some constructive ideas around the future of the museum. What's one word that gives you hope? We've got learning coming in. Opportunity to learn. Kind of connects back to what Alicia was saying about the Royal BC Museum being rooted in education. Lots of words here: transparency, engagement, community-led. I love that energy. Memories, immigration, dialogue, celebration, decolonization, historical, preserving the history, indigenization, inclusiveness, research, factual, see, access, funding, diversity. It looks like community and engagement and memories and transparency are getting larger. So that indicates to me more than one person has selected those. Kid-friendly, co-created, respect, change. I love seeing all these words. It's really inspiring. Visionary, I see, is a new one. And it looks like transparency is gaining some traction, getting quite large as a value. Democratization, that's a new one. Openness. Shared space. It looks like memories is getting larger as well. Engagement. Engaging, provincial, Liv said. This is really useful to see, and I can see that you know, transparency seems to be coming through very strongly. Engagement seems to be coming through very strongly. Dialogue, which is, you know, what we're doing today or starting today. And I know there's a longer process around that. Knowledge, yeah, this is great. Thank you all. We keep all these slides, you know, so we consider this a data source from different engagement events that we're running. So What I think I will do is move us into some questions. And we may ask multiple people from the Royal BC Museum staff to respond to those questions. And I'm going to be pulling from some of the, it looks like Alicia was taking a picture of those great ideas.
It was.
So I will be pulling from different questions that were posed in the Mentimeter. If you have another question that you wanted to have a little more room than the Mentimeter to word, remember there's the Q&A. And since the Menti poll is now closed, the Q&A is the way to see questions going forward. But Alicia, I wanted to start with one question. You can let me know if you think you or Janet is most appropriate to answer this question. But it looks like there's a question on will First Nations have a direct role in determining the future of the museum? So is that a question for Janet or a question for you, do you think?
You know, I will ask Janet to join me in the conversation. And I did see that there was a note also about Métis communities. And yes, we have set up a specific engagement sessions to engage with Métis community members. So absolutely. And maybe I will open it up for Janet to talk specifically about the engagement of communities and perhaps also touch on repatriation, because I know that often is something that is top of mind. But I took a ton of notes. I loved the word cloud. I did take pictures of it. And I'm really looking forward to answering some of the questions that were raised, as many as I can.
Oh, Janet, I think we can't quite hear your sound. There might be something a little off.
Okay, well, maybe
Hello.
Oh, there she is. Okay, good.
Sorry about that. My laptop's been finicky all day. I was just saying thank you to Alicia and thank you to Kieva and thank you to everybody for joining us today. This is so exciting and this work, we've been looking forward to this for months. So just answering a little bit, it's going to be a broad answer, but it's going to try to answer everything in as few words as possible. So we're engaging with First Nations communities directly throughout this process through our phase 1 and our phase 2. And we'll be engaging more specifically our First Nations whose collections or whose belongings are included in our collections at our BCM. And the purpose of all of that is to really learn from communities what the museum should be doing and how we should be caring for these belongings or artifacts, as we're calling them here. We want to make sure that the approach that we're taking is very inclusive and follows the principles of UNDRIP, or ensure that we're really sticking to self-determination and transparency and building trust with our Indigenous communities. That's the first. The second, Alicia did mention that we're talking to Métis community as well. We've had several questions from Métis community acknowledging that their presence has been included in BC since the 1700s or earlier from their records. So with all respect, we want to make sure that we're not leaving anybody out in our discussions, especially our First Nations and Indigenous populations, understanding that we have a commitment to creating space and making space for everybody safely here. That piece, the other piece is I've actually sent out an invitation to the BC Assembly of First Nations, because we want to also make sure that we're reaching out to leadership, our leadership and our advocates for the province. And we're awaiting responses at this point, but we are hosting a specific dialogue session with the BC Assembly of First Nations if we can get anybody that is available for that. And was there another question? Did I answer all the questions? Yeah.
think so. I mean, there was
Repatriation.
definitely a question around how representatives from each nation would be involved in repatriation, and but I think you mostly covered that, unless you want to say anything else about that.
I will speak a little bit more directly to repatriation. So some of you might be aware that repatriation is a program that RBCM has administered for several years prior to 2023, prior to my attendance, and even longer through informal processes. And we've had many curators who have developed partnerships with the First Nations in BC that were strong enough that we were able to return things in generally a good way. So we want to continue that relationship. We want to make sure that if there are nations that want things returned, or if they need support in developing capacity or training or anything, we want to make sure that we are available for all of that. We currently are short-staffed. We're struggling with staffing at this point, but we're working on increasing that capacity so that we can respond to nations as they submit their requests.
Thanks very much, Janet. So next question I wanted to ask is about the CRB, the Collections and Research Building, which we sometimes abbreviate as the CRB, and the British Columbia Archives, which is part of the Royal BC Museum's overall offerings to the public. A couple specific questions came in. One was, what is the status of the building of the Collections and Research Building? There was also a question about, will the archive be located at the Collections and Research Building? And a question about how much access the public will have to the archives.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kiara. And yes, so those are great questions. So the Collections and Research Building, as I mentioned, has one more approval to go through. And once we have that in hand, and we do anticipate to be able to move forward in that respect, sort of middle of February, we will be incorporating the Collections and Research Building much more intensely into our community engagement, because that's going to be a very important part of the conversation. And part of that is because, yes, that is also where the archives will be. So we've had a lot of conversation about accessibility of the archives and how important it is that the archives be accessible to the province. And so we've had conversations where people have raised their concerns about the archives being out of the downtown core and at the CRB, and just wanting to ensure that there are mechanisms to ensure accessibility to the archives. And so I just want to say that those conversations are happening for us, and there are potential partnerships or transportation options that we are going to be looking at over the coming months, so that people are able to have easy access to the archives. And that for us will be a very important piece of advocacy work with respect to funding, because the beauty of the Collections and Research Building is that, you know, we have a new building that is coming. It is going to be an incredible community gathering space. We'll have wonderful learning programming that comes out of the CRB and also out of the museum. And so we're at a place now where we're going to start to see some duplication of things. So from a facility standpoint and security to learning and ensuring that there is still a very strong tie between the two locations. So there's a bigger picture there for us, a conversation that that we are having, that we know needs to be established when the CRB is ready to be opened, and we're ready to serve British Columbians in that way. And that includes a number of, very important conversations with our government partners too, because there will be all kinds of considerations from, budget to logistics to just visitor experience, et cetera, that we'll have to answer to make sure that we are available and accessible. So so there's that. And we definitely look forward to having more conversations about the CRB. We, as I said, we're holding off at this point because we just want to make sure that we're in a position to be able to speak very freely. And again, we just don't want to get in front of things too quickly and potentially create confusion. So in a couple of weeks, there'll be more about that. And that goes back to the fact that, we don't want this to be one conversation where people say, oh, I went to an engagement session with the museum and now I understand what's going on. And so, I don't have to go back, because these sessions will most certainly evolve, and we'll be hoping to be able to continue to hear from people as they evolve and receive input, because, we're just laying the foundation for really meaningful long-term conversations and opportunities for us to listen.
Great, thank you, Alicia. There's another theme of questions that's come in, which is around how the Royal BC Museum will represent the diversity of all people in British Columbia. And I think there's been sort of different lenses on that as different participants have shared. Some people wondering, how the Indigenous story will be told, the First Nation story. Other participants are wondering, what about European Canadians who, what will that history still be present in the museum's narrative? I think there's some interest in, a diversity of people, from different countries, from Asia, from Black cultural heritage. And so, that is a lot of different, there are a lot of different kinds of British Columbians. And I think the curiosity is, what would a new museum look like that's better telling the story of all those different people? And how would you do that?
Yeah, that is a really complex question, because of course there are many potential avenues that we may go with respect to the facility. There's do we keep the facility and refurbish it and provide all of those upgrades that it needs in order to be better functioning? Is it a redevelopment? Is it a phased redevelopment? So there's a number of conversations that our engagement, when we refer to this beginning piece as our dialogue sessions. We call them engagement sessions, but for us, it's actually the first time that we get to have conversations. And I thought that I got really used to Zoom, but I realized after having a lot of in-person meetings that Zoom is actually a bit challenging for these types of conversations, where we're hoping and looking to build meaningful connection with individuals and communities, and to be able to build a sense of familiarity and trust. And so, it's this is an interesting exercise to sort of be talking about all of the different potentials that the museum could take on. And so, I think what I'd like to do is start with this work that we're doing with the province. The building is important. Understanding the way forward for the building is obviously, a part of the conversation, where collectively there's going to be, a need for a solution of some sort. We're not married to any particular idea. This is not a foregone conclusion. We're very interested in listening. And, I didn't come to this role to build a new building. I came to this role because of my work in the Indigenous economy and my love for the idea of an inclusive society and an improved narrative amongst diverse communities in the country. And so this engagement piece and the relationships that we build and the trust that we will earn, and we know that that's something that needs to be earned, is going to allow us to be a facilitator of new conversations, new narratives about who we are collectively, because it will allow us to enhance our understanding of one another as individuals and as members of maybe discrete communities that make up the mosaic of the province. And that's sort of my thinking, is that, you know, the third floor as it looks right now, you've got one side that is the First Peoples Gallery, and it sort of feels like it's a look back in history, like, you know, these people once lived here, and they still live here, and they're still so important to the fabric of this province and to the culture, the culture and the understanding of their traditions enriches everybody. And so, you know, the fact that it sits on its own, separate from the rest of the history of the province, some may find challenging. And I say that because I don't know. We'll actually have to meet with communities to learn, do they want something that is discrete and speaks to their lived experience? Or do we want to tell a story that is more mosaic, where, you know, there really is tapestry sounds so cliche, but it really articulates that, you know, that shared history, that at any given moment there were multiple things going on for certain communities and between certain communities. Some of them were phenomenal and meant that there was, you know, that there were incredible interactions. So for instance, as I understand it, there were really strong historical relationships that were developed between the Chinese community and the Indigenous community, you know, and to unpack that in a way that tells a much more fulsome aspect of the history, just like there were lots of very strong, and Janet will probably talk about this, very strong connections between, you know, white settlers and Indigenous communities. And yet the museum doesn't tell those stories. And yes, there's challenging things that need to be addressed, and there's challenges that we don't want to shy away from, but there's also a lot of incredible connection points that we also don't know about. And this is an opportunity for us to work with communities to really highlight those and to tell a much more fulsome history of the province. And so, you know, and the museum has been starting to do this. I mean, we have built incredible relationships with the South Asian community. We worked very closely with through our curator, Tsui Chung, Dr. Chung, and the learning team with the South Asian Legacy Project. We continue to work closely with them on talking about the South Asian history. On the third floor, the logging section of the museum was done in concert with the Punjabi community. There was also the Chinatown that was installed in Old Town, and the Chinatown in Victoria came to us and said, please don't disrupt that. Please leave that as it is, pending what happens in Old Town. And so we've honored that. We worked very closely with the Black community on Hope Meets Action, which was an incredible exhibition and a very unique experience for us, because usually the museum would be the one that curates the exhibition, and that means writes the language and develops the exhibition, inserts images and photos and artifacts, etc. But in this instance, the Black community said, no, we want to be in charge of the language. We don't want the museum to manage the language. And that is not a typical museum experience, but it was a phenomenal experience. And we embraced that, and we recognized the importance of us doing that, of stepping back and really leaving authentic space for co-creation and for communities to remain the authority of their history. And in addition to that, we worked very closely with one of the professors at U of Vic who has focused on the Japanese history in Canada. And we had an exhibition earlier in the year, well, I guess it was last year now, specific about the Japanese depossessioning. So when Japanese men were taken and held in camps, it meant that they had to vacate their homes and they had to forfeit their property. And this happened in the States also. But the difference between us and the States is that the States, both of us promised the Japanese community members that they would get all of their property back. But we actually didn't honor that. In the US, they did honor that. They held the property and gave it back when the Japanese community members returned back to their place in society. And in Canada, we didn't. And in that exhibition, we actually had a scroll signed by, like, I think it was 1,500. It might have been more than that, but many people signing the petition agreeing to not return the Japanese property to the Japanese people, but instead gave it to settlers. And so, we've been very active in telling these stories. It's just time that we do that in a very concerted effort and continue with those conversations. And yes, and I also want to add that we worked with the Nikkei National Museum in Vancouver and the Cultural Center as we worked on that exhibition. And the exhibition's name was Broken Promises. So just for some context, and that was a real honor for us to participate in that work, and we want to continue to do that. And we feel that it's important that we do that in a way that is very fulsome. So yes, and again, like talking about our partnerships, we refer to them as GLAMs, so galleries, libraries, archives, museums. That's a industry term. Those partnerships are really key to us. And I think in some instances, we've done those partnerships justice and we've been good partners, but we also recognize that in many instances, there's opportunity for us to be stronger partners. And we look forward to those conversations too. And as we make our way through the province, we're looking to work with those partners as a means to host people and to really bring attention to the important work that they do, but also so that we can make sure that we're showing up in a meaningful way with those partners, because together, I think we will be very, we're very committed to serving the different communities, and there are many, many GLAM partners for us to do that with.
Thank you, Alicia. That I learned a lot from that response, and it sounds like there's an effort to really try to meet communities, different communities in British Columbia where their needs are, and be, co-create that process and be responsive to how people want their history told, which may be in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question related to this conversation that I wanted to pull in. It's more of a logistical question, and I think you've spoken a bit about this with Old Town, but just to connect us back, I think the question is wondering why the third floor can't remain open while the certain sections of the third floor have changes made to them, like the Indigenous section. I think this participant understands that there needs to be some changes made to the history. But the question is, the lost revenue alone must make it difficult to run the museum. And then there's just a nice anecdote here that I thought I would share with the group, which says my grandchildren are young, and the years it will take to do this reorganizing will rob them of many happy memories of the museum that my children had when I was parenting them, such as waiting for the train, the silent movie theater, smelling cinnamon in the old kitchen, and so many more. So I think there's just and there were a couple other questions just about you know, why parts of the museum couldn't remain open, and my understanding is there's some sort of facilities and logistical explanations behind that, and then some other explanations as well.
So again, you know, there's opportunities for one, the kitchen is still intact. So I could say that. Lots of people talk about, you know, and I think that was something very special about Old Town, was that it was an immersive experience. So the experience that you had was one that you could, you know, you felt the cobblestones under your feet, and they're still there. And there were the smells and sounds, etc. And so, you know, it's recognized that that has made for very important and often multi-generational experiences. And so, you know, as we are determining what happens with the museum, part of this co-creation and this work within communities is actually, how do we go about reimagining Old Town? So not tearing it down, but using the space to tell different stories. And when we do the small tours, and we've done, you know, we've done a couple, and you know, some with our government partners, et cetera, so that they have a sense of, you know, what is happening for us. But one example that I like to look at is the textile shop. So one of the storefronts is a textile store, and there's fabric in it, and there's bolts of fabric. And it's, you know, it's a very interesting store, but there's a potential to really add to that, you know, that sense of an old store on a walkway in an old, you know, British Columbian town. And an example of that would be that, in fact, the first woman-owned store in British Columbia's history was actually a textile store. And, you know, there's so much potential for having, you know, digging into that experience and digging into the influence of that and telling a story about that. Because it wasn't common for women to be part of commerce. It wasn't common for, like, in fact, women were not part of commerce. That was, you know, the work of men. And you know, I try to imagine what it would be like to be the first woman to own her own store, and what that would mean. And I think that we take this position that, you know, we look back on it in hindsight and we think, wow, that's wonderful. But I actually wonder if that was wonderful for her. Because breaking down barriers and being a thought leader and driving for change is really tough. People have a very hard time with it. And, you know, I tell the story about, I have 3 kids. My oldest is Emily, my son is Reese, and my youngest daughter is Piper. And they span many ages. Emily is almost 26. Piper just turned 12. I had Emily in my undergrad. She was 3 when I went to law school in Toronto. And you know, I named her Emily after Emily Murphy, who was one of the famous 5 who were successful in getting women identified as persons with the Privy Council. The Privy Council is in the UK, it's in England, and they themselves did not identify their own women as persons, yet they agreed that because Canada was this new, you know, evolution of society with so much potential, that they approved women being identified as persons. And therefore, you know, we get to vote, and I get to have the career that I have, and I got to go to university, and as a single mom even. And so there's so many, you know, beautiful things about that story. But what's really interesting is that Nellie McClung, these women were not heroes in their communities. Like, in fact, most people were really angry with them. And it cost them some of their most intimate relationships because they were so passionate about change. And that is inspiring because it takes courage to affect change. And so, like, when I look at that textile store and I think about that story, and I wonder about that woman who was the first woman to own her own business in British Columbia, I want to know more about her. I want to understand that. And I want my daughters to see it, and I want my son to see it. So, like, these are moments that, you know, we can really capitalize on that we haven't yet. And it doesn't mean that we are, and I hope that people see this in that example, this is not cancel culture. This is not excluding, you know, is not excluding parts of society. You know, it's actually highlighting a really important moment in the evolution of our society that has served all of us better. I mean, even now we talk about how much stronger our economy would be if more women were successful in coming back from COVID. Like that, I'm part of the Prosperity Project, which is all about supporting women in entering the workforce and staying in the workforce and being part of all of that. And I mean, we're still struggling. We think that we aren't, but we are. And you know, so if we're still struggling decades later, you know, those are really interesting stories that can be part of our truth telling.
Thanks, Alicia. That was a very powerful story. I appreciate you sharing that. I know that people probably need to move on with their morning, so I think I'm going to just ask one more question. And I think the question kind of leads to some of the next steps of how people could be involved. So maybe as you answer this question, Chris can also provide some links in the chat for how people can continue to engage with the Royal BC Museum if they'd like to, and we hope that you do. So the question is around the government mandate letter, and just to sort of give people a sense that, you know, I think that's what the person is referring to in this question is some criteria that the government has set out for the Royal BC Museum's future, since the Royal BC Museum and the government obviously work so closely together and are interconnected. And the question is, how will the Royal BC Museum consider the feedback that you receive through these spring engagement sessions that you've been mentioning? If that feedback doesn't align with or goes beyond your current mandate letter, is the 2021-2022 mandate letter on your website the most current? So that's kind of a secondary question, but I think the core question here is, you know, if you're hearing things from the community that don't align with the mandate letter or go beyond that, you know, what will that mean for next steps?
That's a really good question. And it's also the reason why we're going through the engagement process, is because at the end of the day, people are the ones that advocate for the government based upon what they hope to see as far as government decisions and ways forward. And so this is our opportunity to, and the government has like mandated us, like tasked us with going through this process. And that tells me that there is a real interest on their part to hear from British Columbians and to understand how the museum can continue to contribute to British Columbians and in fact do it better, be more impactful, be relevant. And we're committed to that. We have a sense of what that means, but that's actually for us to sit and listen to, as opposed to come to our own conclusions. And so at the end of the day, how we see this is, you know, the public informs the government, and then the government makes decisions based upon what is heard by community members. And what we've been doing is asking people to participate by way of comments and emails. And we have the survey, of course, and I hope people will take it. This piece is about opening the conversation. The actual formal structure of engagement, where we're going to be asking very pointed questions and pulling, I'll say, data, but essentially the sentiments of British Columbians from that information will then be driven through that part of the process, but we will still be doing report backs. So on our website, the whole province will be able to see our schedule of engagements, where we are going, when we will be there. They'll also see where we've been, how many people attended, what were the common themes of the conversation. And then that way people can see, because I don't anticipate that the conversations we have when we are hosting Victoria sessions is going to be similar to the conversations that we're going to have when we meet with people in Prince Rupert or Fort St. John. I mean, every region and community has, just like the multicultural communities too, for that matter, have their own objectives and their own challenges and considerations. And so, you know, that information will be shared through a report back, and will be broken down so that we can actually articulate the various voices, and not be looking to just like amalgamate it into one.
Thanks, Alicia. I think that's a good place to end today. I know that there's definitely energy from folks to maybe have more conversation and questions. So I think Chris has chatted an email where you can continue to send thoughts if you'd like. And there's also a survey that you can take to share more about what you would like to see in the next phase of this work with the deeper community engagement. So we hope that you take that survey. I did just want to share a couple of words that we shared in that word cloud in the Mentimeter to kind of leave us with today, that were about the future of the museum. And I think this helps to sort of sum up some of the different perspectives that people in the group had today. So I saw a desire for the museum to be a place of knowledge and history, to be a place for education, to be a place for memories, to be a safe space, to be a transparent space, and an engaging space, to be a place of dialogue, a kid-friendly space, a community-led space, a space that tells the truth, and lastly, a space of celebration. And I think that that is a great note to end on today. So I want to thank everyone so much for coming today. And we look forward to engaging with you more in the future. Take care, everyone.
Can I add just a couple of things? I'm sorry, I know everybody's very busy. But one thing I want to add is actually the exhibitions that are coming, just so that people know what to expect at the museum. So I just want to say that in April, we are looking at bringing in 2 exhibitions, one of which is the Dinos of BC, and fantastically, that is a homegrown museum created by our own paleontology team and led by our paleontologist, Dr. Victoria Arbour. We're really excited for that because, of course, that is a representation of dinosaurs discovered within our own province. We will also be hosting, we're in the process of signing contracts, so we're just waiting for finalization of dates, etc. But we'll be hosting a local Indigenous created exhibition. We'll be holding that exhibition down in Clifford Carl Halls. So the public can come in and enjoy it without paying for the without paying for admission. Also, Clifford Carl Hall, I believe we're going to be turning the Pocket Gallery into a space where the public can also come in and learn about our engagement process. Where have we been? What are the conversations? What are some of the themes? And we're going to use that space to really open up the conversation about this process specifically and what we're learning. In June, we will be bringing in 2 other exhibitions, another dinosaur exhibitions. We're going to bring in Sue the T-Rex, and that will be up on the 3rd floor. This is an incredible exhibition. It was created by the Field Museum in Chicago, and it shows one of the, I think it actually is the biggest T-Rex that has ever been discovered. And it actually is, it is the one skeleton that was, for the most part, nearly fully intact. And to give you context for people whose kids, I know my son was crazy about dinosaurs when he was young, the head of Sue weighs, I think it's about 600 pounds. So, I mean, it's really going to be an outstanding experience. And then also in June, we're really honored to be bringing in the Angkor Wat Lost Empire of Cambodia exhibition. And that is like a beautiful exhibition that includes about 125 sacred artifacts from Cambodia. And we'll also have a feature IMAX film that runs alongside it, which I've heard is absolutely spectacular. So, you know, and as far as events, we are actually looking at setting a date to have a spring event where we have we'll open it up and enjoy an evening with guests, and which will feel much more like some of the evening events that we've had before. And we just really look forward to having everybody in and being inspired by your excitement and watching everybody be inspired themselves. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time today.
And Alicia, I just have heard that Janet and Chris are willing to stay on the Zoom to answer further questions if people want to stay on. I think we're going to conclude the program at this time formally. Alicia, I know you have to run to another event, but there will be a couple of Royal BC Museum staff that will stay on, and I will stay on if people want to stay on to ask some further questions. So we'll say goodbye to Alicia and goodbye to all those who need to leave. And we have about 15 more minutes for those who want to stay. So thank you everyone for attending. And if people have further questions, we will stay on and you can submit them in the Q&A.
Thank you. And I hope to meet everybody. I hope that the conversation continues, and I really appreciate everybody's participation. So thank you.
So Chris, if you want to come back
yeah,
on.
and I will officially stop the recording as well.